Thanks for being here on the first day of the semester, and a rainy one too, so we appreciate your coming out. This Annenberg Research Center session is co-sponsored by the Norman Lear Center. I'm Marty Kaplan. For those of you who don't know me, I direct the Lear Center, the Norman Lear Center, which is here at the Annenberg School, and if you don't know what that is, I invite you to visit learcenter.org. Next time at the Research Center, seminar rather, I'm just going to put in a plug for Monday, March 28th. Colleen Macklin from Parsons is going to present Systems at Play, looking at the world like a game designer. So today we're very fortunate to have Joe Karaganis. He is the wrangler, editor, and to some degree author of a massive study. Here's how massive it is. And that's double-sided. Called Media Piracy and Emerging Economies. He has directed this project for the last several years. Something like 35 social scientists have been involved. The organization sponsoring it, the Social Sciences Research Council, has a special place in my heart because much of what they do is strategic research. They take areas of public policy where they can make a difference through research, through testimony, through advocacy, but based on very, very solid empirical research. So this is one of their signature projects. It's just out. There's on the what would be the copyright page, it says that someone at a university who wants to read this should pay $8, which is what we did, and after some other stuff, the last line is, for those who must have it for free anyway, you probably know where to look. So that's just a peephole into the point of view in the report. We're very fortunate to have him. Please join me in welcoming Joe Karaganis.
Thank you very much. Am I going to block people's view too much by standing? Is that okay? Well, I also need to sort of read my notes, but you are in the epicenter of these debates, so I assume they're more present to you than they are for some of the audiences I've spoken to this about. Obviously, with the studios in the city and the media industries more generally, questions of piracy and enforcement are sort of ever present. If you follow these debates, and over the past few years it's become increasingly difficult not to, you're probably familiar with some of the headline numbers that tend to drive the conversation. Very high levels of piracy in developing countries especially. Typically numbers are around 70, 80, 90% rates of piracy in terms of the software markets, the record market, the CD markets, the DVD markets. So just to give you a bit of history of where this project came from, and when we started looking at these issues, our interest in piracy really came out of a set of inquiries into what the digital transition looked like more generally, both in the United States and in developing countries, and what in particular social sciences could bring to these conversations that at the time were really dominated mostly by lawyers and economists. So part of the question was, well, what are the lawyers doing badly? And looking at piracy was one of the answers that just popped straight to the top. So the first iterations of this project really go back as far as 2003. It really took us till 2006 to secure both the funding and develop some of the networks of partners that we needed to begin to pull this together. And as we were collectively looking at some of these claims about piracy in emerging economies, it seemed important to try and reverse the equation a little bit. There seemed to be some obvious problems with how the debate was being presented and structured. 90% rates of piracy in a particular market is the perspective from the content and rights holders' position, but if you're looking at it instead from the consumer's position, those distinctions are somewhat immaterial. What you have is a spectrum of access to different types of media goods, much of which may be through pirated channels, some of which may be through legal channels. The claim that at the time the claims that were in circulation tended to support the idea that Many of these pirated forms of access were subtracting from legitimate sales. That seemed very improbable to us in context where the price of the media good was relative to local incomes exorbitant. The price of a DVD at $15 in terms of local incomes in South Africa or Brazil or India really made those goods luxury goods, not something that was going to be an object of collection like they've become in high-income countries. So, what we thought we would begin with was really this consumer perspective, this reversal of the question, and the recognition that piracy isn't simply a drain on the media economies of these countries. It is the media economy in many places. It goes around what constitutes criminal activity. And to qualify for criminal activity in copyright infringement, you had to demonstrate a profit motive. It had to be commercial activity, where commercial was defined not by the scale of activity, but by the presence of profits. And so what's happened over a decade is that definition has been progressively expanded to the point where, under U.S. law, any receipt of any infringing good of any value triggers the criminal penalty. The threshold is basically receipt of anything of value. So I will wager that if not all of us, almost all of us in this room are subject to 3 years in prison and $250,000 per infringing act under the Net Act, which is it's remarkable. It's universal legal jeopardy for activities that are just part of the daily life of most Americans, certainly most Brazilians, South Africans, Chinese. Completely unapplied in virtually all cases. The number of prosecutions under the Net Act have been, there are just a handful of software pirates who've been subject to it. But this kind of extreme ramping up of the legal framework of enforcement and completely underdeveloped application of enforcement is characteristic in all the countries we've looked at. So you see a real divergence between the laws on the books and the actual practice. And that has all sorts of perverse outcomes, and that's part of what we've documented in the report. So, it's been both an enormously complicated exercise in coordinating this project, but also an incredible privilege in many ways to have this wealth of sort of people working together on the same project, and to be able to bring together as many not just institutions but perspectives and capacities to bear on the work as we have. And I think if it's, in addition to its sort of contributions to the literature and sort of substantive findings, it's also, I think, one of the more successful and interesting methodological syntheses that I've had a chance to participate in. But I think more generally too, it's really a merger of policy analysis, of anthropological and ethnographic work on the ground, of political economy, in ways that make 6 or 7 chapters, six country studies, each documenting very similar practices with piracy and enforcement. In fact, very diverse explorations of these terrains. So one of the things that satisfies me most about the report is that over 6 country studies, they're different and interesting in their own terms, and those terms are different in part because of the different capabilities that the teams brought to bear. So there were about 35 researchers involved over 3 years, and that's sort of the scale of the enterprise. This is what we've ended up with, if you haven't had a chance to look online. Major country studies of South Africa, Russia, Brazil, and India. Minor studies of Mexico and Bolivia, where we just met some people who were working in similar directions and were able to integrate them into the project. 2 framing chapters up front, and a coda on book piracy, which is really about the 500-year history of incumbents and new entrants into the book market, and how the new entrants are always characterized as pirates before they're kind of folded into the legal regime that governs book production and distribution. And that was a story that seemed very pertinent to what we're looking at today, where again and again in these media markets you see conditions of incumbents where new entrants take advantage of gray legal terrain as technologies change. They're almost always described as pirates by the incumbents. Eventually they get folded into the legal regime and become the incumbents. Cycle forward 20 years and they're the enforcers of the legal regime against some new incumbent. So I think we're beginning to see that process at work with some of the new media innovators in the current generation of the copyright debate, as groups like Google and Netflix or the Huffington Post, for that matter, take advantage of gray area around what you can do with other people's content, and then develop their own investments in content production and become quickly those legal ambiguities quickly get resolved either through the law or through just the practice, and they become the next round of incumbents. So I will kind of rush through much of this presentation, I think, just in the interest of leaving some time for questions. I want to talk briefly about the organization of piracy, and particularly, as I said, in relation to illicit markets from the consumer side of the equation, where you're really looking at this kind of spectrum of availability of goods, and particularly in contrast to the industry perspective of just focusing on what the legal supply is. The legal supply is it's the wrong way to look at actual practices of media use in most of the developing world, for sure. Just to preview, I mean, we reached two conclusions, and at one level they're incredibly obvious conclusions, and could have been found on the basis of 2 days of field work as opposed to 3 years. One is that high prices, low incomes, and cheap, ubiquitous digital technologies create the conditions for piracy. The second is that enforcement is really just what happens around the edges of that relationship. Right? Enforcement, we can't determine any significant impact to enforcement in any of the media markets we've looked at. 10 years of ramped up efforts. There's a real question about what they've achieved. We can show impact of enforcement on specific channels of piracy. So you have these massive police ramp-ups of raids and sort of street policing against retail DVD. Oh, excuse me. Let me turn that off.
The MPAA.
Yeah.
You on that ringtone, sir?
I do not. So raid-based enforcement, I'll come back to this briefly. You can drive piracy out of the organized retail sector. That shouldn't be a big surprise. Retailers are fairly exposed, institutionalized. If you send the police in, you can harass them. But it's a game of whack-a-mole, and I was at Paramount this morning where they were hammering on this new problem they're having of streaming movie sites. Right, so streaming movie sites didn't exist 2 years ago. Now they're quite common. The proliferation of distribution channels really makes it difficult to determine any impact of enforcement or develop any real benchmarks for what the scope of piracy is, or what its impact is, for that matter. And then I'll come back to a couple issues around the organization of enforcement, particularly the ubiquitous claims that piracy is conducted primarily by organized crime groups, or in some cases terrorist groups. This is an issue we've taken on pretty directly. Second, just the strange case of business software. The organization of the software market is completely different in ways that really, I think, need to be dissociated from the debate about other kinds of recorded media, DVDs and CDs. And then third, what happens when scarce enforcement resources confront a ubiquitous practice like piracy? And here it's it's the story I was beginning to describe, where you can have a massive scaling up of certain kinds of enforcement, but in practice there's almost no capacity to follow through on that through due process in the courts, through other kinds of activity that would actually lead to a reduction in the practice. So to get a couple qualifications out of the way, I'm not really going to talk about data, although there's a long chapter in the report about the quality of the data that's used to support these debates. I won't really get into policy issues, although there are ways in which much of this report fits into a kind of policy conversation around ACTA and USTR practices and the Special 301 report. I can follow that up in questions if you're curious. We have a long section on consumer attitudes that I won't really get into, and the short version is consumers don't care. Price and access are the things that matter to them. Any ambivalence they have about piracy with regard to artist revenues or associations with other kind of criminal activity get overridden as soon as they run into a price or access problem that they want to overcome. And this is part of the case I was making this morning to Paramount. I mean, you have this massively successful marketing campaign for Hollywood goods, for Hollywood's movies, right? That extends far beyond this very narrow and mostly inadequate distribution infrastructure for providing people access to those goods at affordable prices. And it's really this gap that we're describing in this report, the difference between the globalization of media demand and this hugely under-provided infrastructure, or under-provisioned infrastructure for providing access to it at affordable prices. And I think this is a view of the problem that's beginning to seep into the industry groups themselves. We quote Robert Bauer from the MPAA to conclude the first chapter, and what he's signaling is a very different view of what the market looks like than, say, Jack Valenti, back when Valenti was sort of leading the charge against pirates and equating them with the Boston Strangler, and there's iconic associations that are really about trying to ramp up the level of horrors that you associate with media piracy, so that when you hear about organized crime, or there's an effort to equate these very banal quotidian acts of copying a DVD or sharing a file with all these other harms that come in through other kinds of IP counterfeiting or other kinds of IP-related crime. So we've just tried to pry these things apart so that you can begin to have a clearer picture of the different elements of the problem and what the exposure of the different industry groups is, what their recourse is in terms of technical protection measures, or because the expectations that shape the DVD market are different than the expectations that shape the video game market. And there's an enormous range of issues here that tend to get conflated into this giant single problem called piracy. But when you tease them apart, it just begins to look very different. We don't see any clear evidence of any real losses in the software markets, or if there are losses in the software markets, they haven't been. There's been no work to really pull that apart and identify where they fall. The video game markets, the online gaming business is, for all intents and purposes, immune to piracy. Anytime you have a subscription-based model, piracy's out the door. The CD business, well, I'm sure most of you can tell a story about the decline of the record industry for the big four labels that still rely 70% on a dying medium like the CD. You have a real problem of transitioning to other business models. Those transitions are inevitable in lots of respects. And same will happen to the DVD. So I'm getting a little bit off my talking points here, but broadly speaking, this is the transition we're talking about, from a very hard line on enforcement. Right? So these are pulling from a couple of the iconic quotes in this area, right? The Valenti quote from '83, where he's talking about the VCR, right, which then went on to become this huge cash cow for Hollywood, and the DVD even more so. To what ends up being a much more refined view of what piracy is signaling in terms of unmet demand. So the fact that you can have somebody at the MPAA in 2009 saying these things is a real evolution in the thinking of industry. And I think it's still an unresolved split. I mean, you still have this really hardline rhetoric that gets used in the enforcement debates, and in some respects, a much more refined view of what piracy is that feeds into the business model debates. So, if we have any hopes for the reception of this report among the industry groups, it's to try and support this shift from the hard line on enforcement to the soft line around business models. So, I'll say a few words about our, how we present some of these media market issues through pricing, and the relating pricing and income. This kind of chart won't be a surprise to you. So, enormous differences in GDP per capita between highly developed countries and less developed ones. And if you relate that to the price of goods, you get you can do some very simple and somewhat gimmicky and at the limit kind of unreliable comparisons of goods and their relative affordability in the market, and that can provide a kind of window onto these media markets that has been surprisingly powerful as we begin to present the work. So the Dark Knight became a kind of iconic example for us. This is the opening of the Dark Knight in Beijing in 2008. And I was tempted to use this as the cover of the book because it has all these nice, it's a kind of allegory of piracy rather than just the kind of hit you in the face piles of pirated discs. But nobody understood that when they looked at it, so unfortunately. But here's, you can go out in the streets, survey the, roughly speaking, the legal price of the good, the pirate price of the good, and then in both cases we converted it into what we were calling comparative purchasing power price, which is the cost of the good for Americans if that good cost the same share of GDP per capita as it did in India or Russia or wherever. And the point here is that these things are extremely expensive. That's the only point. They're luxury goods. They're just not in the same order of availability as they are for the U.S. or European consumer. We also realized quite quickly that there's essentially a cartel pricing in the DVD market. There's a global floor for DVD prices for any new releases. It's around $14. There are lots of reasons why the price can go higher than that, but it almost never goes below that. And that reflects the control that the big studios have over distribution. They can set prices. CPP price is more or less what I showed you, so or what I just recounted. If you look in the pirate market, one of the sort of more interesting findings is that, in effect, the pirate market is pricing the goods in ranges that are roughly comparable to the U.S. and European markets. So if there's a mass market in these countries, it's in the pirate market. It's not in the legal market. And then finally, if you look at the evolution of pirate prices or their differences across geography, there's a story here that we tell at some length in the report. It's only partly visible in these numbers, but 10 years ago, there's been a tremendous change in the structure of the market based on the explosion of consumer technologies, right? The explosion of DVD players, which flooded the market starting in 2003, 2006. Many of the countries we were looking at went from 1% penetration to 50% or 60%, where everybody had a DVD player. And that was really a product of this huge Chinese ramp-up of DVD player production. The same thing happened in the burner field. So suddenly burners became these commodity items. So where in 2000 you had to have major capital investments to build a DVD factory to reproduce these things, by 2006, 2007, everybody could make them and everybody was making them. So, the other way to look at the problem of piracy over the last decade is that you have this incredible expansion of the consumer infrastructure for digital media and almost no legal content to fill it. So what's going to fill it? People filled it themselves. They started copying things. They started circulating them. Another side to this question is really what happens to pricing over time. So over 10 years, you have a collapse in prices, where a competitive, 10 years ago, pretty much all of these countries would have been around $5 for a high-quality CD or DVD. Today, where there are highly competitive markets, it's $1 or less. Right? So India, Mexico, those are super competitive pirate markets. Prices have collapsed. Countries that are in between are, that's where you have a story to tell. Something is going on there. Either they're acting fairly effectively against retail piracy in the streets, or there are constraints on supply, sometimes by the vendors themselves who collude on prices, constraints on raw materials. So we document some of those differences in the market that you can sort of tease out in terms of how the pirated goods are priced. In the U.S., the pirated disc market is gone for all intents and purposes. It's just a niche market. I mean, you can find people on the streets of New York who will sell you, a camcorded version of the latest hit, but it's super marginal. It's been displaced entirely by online piracy. Russia is an interesting case where we were kind of struck by this initial finding of very high prices for pirated goods in Russia, and the explanation we arrived at for that was that Russia's a limit case in the study for lots of reasons. One of which is the effective state control of the pirate market, where in 2006, 2007, pretty much anybody running a DVD factory in Russia has or has had state protection of one kind or another. Some of them are de facto state-run enterprises where they're located on military bases. They're located on, there's just this complete interpenetration of legal licensed DVD production, pirate DVD production, often from the same factories. There's a whole vocabulary for describing illicit overproduction from the same factory that's producing the licensed ones. And in effect, our conclusion was that through these channels, the big players in Russia exercised enough market power to control pricing. The prices were high in Russia because the government was very effective in cracking down against the little, low-end producers who in India or Mexico are just flooding the market with pirated goods. In Russia, 2006, 2007, there was a massive enforcement effort that drove out the whole middle tier of pirate suppliers, but did nothing to impact the top level, sort of industrial suppliers. So you ended up with a very consolidated pirate market that was able to maintain some control on pricing. So we also thought that, well, maybe this is different if you look at domestically produced film. Maybe local film companies are pricing their goods at more affordable prices for local audiences. That turns out to be mostly not true. If you look at the sort of top-tier productions in most countries, they're already integrated into global Hollywood. They're already part of the global distribution channels, investment channels. Pricing follows from that. So they're really not, they're on the same order of pricing as buying a copy of The Dark Knight. The main exception to that rule is when you have countries that are where the media markets are dominated by domestic firms, and this is something that came through very strongly in the India study. We can envision extending it in little ways to Nigeria, to China, a handful of other places where the domestic market is controlled by domestic firms at both the level of production and distribution and exhibition. So what happens when you have domestic control of these industries is you get competition. You get an effort to serve domestic audiences, and that just implies a much different level of pricing than the multinational companies do in these markets. So in India, there are a variety of companies that compete directly with the pirate market at prices that, while still high in kind of CPP terms, are an order of difference with respect to the market that they can address. I could do something similar in the CD market, but I won't waste time on that since I want to leave some time for questions. So there's a question about the rationality of this. Why is it rational to maintain $15 DVD prices in Brazil or South Africa or Russia? And the conclusion we reached is that basically the developing markets don't matter. So if you're interested in maximizing your profits across a global market, the most important thing you can do is protect the high-value markets. So all the other ones, they just don't signify. There are, if you want to look at it in film, it's basically the same story. So that green line is India, but everything else is just down at the bottom. It barely registers. So our conclusion about multinational investment strategies in developing markets was really twofold. One was that their first priority is to protect the high-value markets, and to do so, among other things, around price. So there's a problem of, how much should these goods cost? What should a DVD cost? Well, it doesn't need to cost anything. The cost of manufacture is zero, digital distribution, whatever. But there are important perceptions about how much something should cost. And that perception for the studios for the last decade has been set at $15, $25. What they don't want to do is begin to erode the perceived value of the good through radically different or differential pricing in developing markets. And there are costs to operating a highly differentiated market too. But so if you talk to the industry people, they say, well, we don't want parallel importation of our $2 DVDs in Brazil into the U.S. for where we're selling them for $18 or whatever. And that's a legitimate problem, but from a public policy perspective, what you're doing is saying, well, we will deny affordable. You just have to pick your problem. What problem do you want? Do you want to deny most of the people in the country affordable access to the good, or do you want to create a border control problem? And from my perspective, that's a no-brainer. You want a border control problem. And as the digital stuff makes all the border issues largely irrelevant anyway. But it's been a falsely constructed debate, in my view. So the first thing they want to do is protect the high value markets, and the second thing they want to do is maintain dominant positions in these markets as they slowly grow. So incomes are rising in Brazil and Russia. Those companies want to be dominant in those markets as those incomes rise, as the markets grow. They don't want competitors, and so they'll sit there and maintain their roughly static pricing structures with those two expectations in place. And that would have been a viable strategy. In some respects, it still is a viable strategy, but for the fact of this massive technological revolution, which has created this hugely democratized access to digital culture, to the means of production, to the means of copying, to means of distribution. And as we've released the report, this pricing stuff, it just gets eaten up. I mean, we've tracked 100 stories about the report so far, and maybe 80 of them are about price. And so this is from O Estado de Sao Paulo. It's a Brazilian paper. And this is it's just enormously powerful. People understand these media markets in terms of what they cost. If they understand anything about them, it's how much they cost. But at the same time, they don't know how much they cost to other people. So at some level, we're putting together some very obvious information in ways that to people in Brazil or to people in South Africa, it proves to be a very powerful combination. I will just skim through this very quickly, and we can come back to it in questions. The organization of enforcement. I've alluded to some of it anyway. Organized crime. This is our punchline, right? No systematic connections to drug trafficking, prostitution, or other major features of organized crime. And we present this in a very circumscribed way, so that there are certainly connections between media piracy and organized criminal activity of one kind or another, but they are bit players. They are at the edges of the story. The main part of the story is about non-commercial digital distribution. It's about small-scale cottage industry just flooding the market with locally produced DVDs. The margins in the business have collapsed. There's much less incentive for organized crime to be involved. The terrorist stuff is just barely worth talking about. I mean, the evidence that gets cited in reports like this one, which was MPA funded through RAND, they look back to IRA selling of video cassettes in the streets of Dublin in the 80s. They look back. I mean, there's just the evidentiary practices are really weak in the parts of it that we've been able to look at in detail. Basically, our argument is wherever you have a high-value illicit market, you're likely to attract organized criminal activity or terrorist groups. Anybody who's making revenues out of illegal activity. That's just not the main story in the media markets anymore. Still clearly the main story in contraband cigarettes, in other kinds of high-value contraband and counterfeiting. But it's a real disservice to the debate to try and read piracy through an organized criminal lens. Software piracy, these are some fairly iconic quotes, but the main story here is that if you're a monopolist in these markets, what you need is you just need to dominate the market. You need market share. And the software companies understand that as part of their business model. Microsoft has 95% of the market in China, 95% in South Africa and India because of piracy of their goods, and they wouldn't trade that for the world. That's the most valuable thing they have in those markets. And then what happens is after the fact, they'll go in and enforce against large institutions, schools, municipalities, large businesses. And the enforcement fights in those countries are really at the level of small and medium business. So where's the point at which it becomes, where's the point of diminishing returns and enforcement against small business? It's an entirely viable business model. Microsoft's still growing 30% a year based on this, higher in most of these emerging economies. I'll just pass through that. RAID-based enforcement is pretty much what I already alluded to. This is just how it works. You can scale up raids. The thing you can't scale up easily is due process, where the ratios are just extreme. And the problem is that policing and due process are really there are zero-sum games in these countries. If you start pulling resources away from one kind of criminal activity to go after copyright infringement, you are diminishing the ability of an already overstressed system to deal with things like let me come back to this deal with things like murders. So violent crime is the main story if you're a criminal judge in South Africa or Russia. The systems are completely overstressed. What do you do, or if you're a prosecutor for that matter, what do you do if you have a pile of infringement cases and a pile of kidnapping cases? And one of our investigators spent a couple of years making these kinds of decisions, and the answer is almost always, unless you're under direct pressure from your superiors, you ignore the copyright cases, or you settle them as quickly as possible, and either dismiss the charges or reduce the penalties to zero, or consider it, just get it out of the way as quickly as possible, and try and deal with the larger social problems that confront the judicial systems of these countries. So I alluded to the problem of what happens when you have universal jeopardy because of the way the laws on the books have been ramped up, but very haphazard enforcement. And the answer is that enforcement becomes a resource that can be captured. So it can be captured for commercial purposes, it can be captured for political purposes. This is the story of the capture of enforcement for political purposes, where the Russian government was using the excuse of software piracy and the fact that in virtually any organization in Russia, you could prosecute any organization for felony level software piracy because they're all using pirated software, and the threshold is incredibly low. So at one level, it's not a story about piracy at all. I mean, it's just a story about using the law to suppress dissent. But that's the story that Russia's sort of at the extreme end of it, but it's true everywhere. The enforcement is incredibly arbitrary. There's just not the resources aren't there to provide due process at anything like the level that deterrence would require. And so this deterrence standard is very important in these debates, where TRIPS requires that the TRIPS agreement, which is part of the WTO, which is sort of the international framework that governs the IP area, requires that countries maintain deterrent penalties. Well, as we've looked at this, there are no countries that maintain deterrent penalties. If by that you mean any countries where there's evidence that piracy has diminished in scope or prevalence as a result of the extreme penalties on the books. And that includes the U.S., where the couple file sharing cases that have come to trial have resulted in utterly absurd penalties of $1.9 million for the sharing of 24 songs and $675,000 for the sharing of 30 songs. And there's this kind of wild ramping up of the liability, but applied in incredibly arbitrary ways. So that's a real problem. And this is how the story has been told in Russia. Russia's constantly under pressure to sort of toe the line with respect to U.S. needs. So 2006, 2007 is when the Russians began their major crackdown on piracy. Quickly, Russian businesses discovered that they could use the piracy crackdown and the sort of the increase in police raids in general to harass their competitors. So, you had the emergence of this kind of massive capture of the enforcement process for competitive reasons. When the IIPA reported this, they said, well, and here they just goofed up the numbers. They conflated numbers from different categories. Said, here's what's happening with convictions. We had this huge spike when they were listening to us, and then as soon as we stopped paying attention, things dropped way down. It's not. First of all, those aren't the right numbers, but they've underwritten this account of Russian backsliding on enforcement that has nothing to do with what's actually going on in Russia. So what's happened is that with the ramp up and basically the corruption of the process, you began to get business pushback against enforcement, to the extent that this became the official position of the government. And then you had there were a subsequent set of laws passed that limited the power of the police to go in and raid businesses on a regular basis. And the pushback against enforcement became an anti-corruption policy of the Russian government. And so things have just sort of they've plateaued. You still have high levels of convictions, but they're not going to it's not a curve that's going to go up forever. But So Joe Biden goes to Russia last week, and he's browbeating them for the failures of their enforcement practices vis-a-vis this bilateral agreement that had been signed in 2006. And the kernel of it is this kind of just simple misreporting of the data. So we've only scratched the surface, I think, in terms of the evidentiary standards that are used to support a lot of this policy debate. And it's really there's a lot more there to dig up for people with enough patience. I will just leave it at that. This is the license that Marty was referring to. We released it under what we're calling a consumer's dilemma license, which basically means that at one level, if you're trying to download the report from within a high-income country, it routes you through an $8 paywall, and if you're in a medium or low-income country, it's free. And then in addition to that, there's a $2,000 commercial use license for businesses engaged in either the production or enforcement of copyrights with value with over $1 million in revenue. So this has been a kind of separate story, and it's been kind of fun to watch it play out because it's been controversial for reasons you can imagine. We've gotten a lot of coverage in the tech press. Managing all the press stuff is really what's been engaging me for the last couple of weeks, and hopefully, if we do this right, I think this will be an unavoidable document in this debate, and that's, I think so far the industry response has been minimal because they're hoping it will just go away. But I think we're on the right curve for making that impossible. I'll leave it at that and invite questions.
First, thank you very much for
During the process of actually presenting your research, like Paramount this morning and whatnot, has anybody ever brought up just outright decommissioning the standard distribution model that seems to be failing them?
Decommissioning?
In the sense that, let's say, like I can't buy DVDs anymore, but I'm okay with paying $8 to Netflix every month to stream all the movies I want, plus I don't have to take care of them, I don't have to move them around, et cetera, Are any of the people studios you're presenting to, or people in your report said, okay, well, using this as a benchmark, we should start looking at other ways to make money beyond the standard model? I mean, they are, but I'm trying to see if somebody's kicking the whole theater thing to the curb.
This is a tough one. I don't have a good answer for it because we're just beginning to get a sense of what industry thinks about the report, and although there was a lot of industry input into the report, they haven't really had a chance to react to it in its finished form. I think on general the answer with all of these incumbents is that they take their highest profits as the benchmark for all future profits. So anything that any decrease in profits from the high water mark becomes a sign of crisis. And in the film business, you can look at this pretty clearly. I mean, the exhibition has been setting records for the last 4 or 5 years in the U.S. and globally. There's a huge revenue stream from merchandising, but the DVD is about to get crushed, and they do know that. But I don't know the economics of film well enough to have a very informed opinion about this. But there's a view that the economics of filmmaking are so fragile that any departure from the sort of high water mark of the DVD market is going to have catastrophic effects in terms of film production. I doubt it, frankly. This was a business that was $20 billion smaller 15 years ago. It could be, there's no God-given right to a market of a certain size or revenues of a certain size. It will find a way to survive the partial collapse of the home video market, which is it's not just the DVD market; it is also the home video market more generally. And I suspect that there's sort of an emerging awareness bordering on consensus that the next version of home video distribution is going to be a lot less profitable than the current one.
I read that Senator Dodd said that the word piracy is too romantic and they're going to change it to, I don't know, well, they have some technical word that's less romantic. What's your reaction to that?
I hadn't heard that, but that's been circulating. The thing you find is that there are chestnuts that get circulated over and over and over again in these debates, and that's one of them. The idea that somehow piracy has become denatured as a term.
Somali,
Yeah.
yeah.
I don't know what they're going to come up with to replace it. I doubt
They
that
said it
one will
was
fly.
deadly. I don't remember what it was, but certainly wasn't anything anyone will remember.
Yeah. Well, we had this debate too when we were thinking about what terminology we'd use, and yeah. I mean, there are lots of reasons to avoid the term piracy, but we decided that it was just the inevitable sort of point of the inevitable basis of any discussion of these issues, and that we qualify it all sorts of ways in the report. But if you're not talking about piracy, you're imposing an immediate kind of obstacle to people engaging in the conversation. And we thought there was plenty of work to be done in just telling a different story about it.
Quick question. Late last week, there was a 3-day-long debate in the Los Angeles Times online regarding these very issues, to which you contributed in the comments. But I was curious about this is between Harold Feld's Public Knowledge and then the author of it's on the tip of my tongue. I can't quite get it out.
Keen, this is last
yeah,
name, right?
exactly. So he was putting forward kind of the industry drone arguments. I was curious. That seemed a fair encapsulation of what I've seen in DC policy debates, and from what you've learned from this report, how would you have commented on, or with apologies to folks who haven't read it, what did you come away from with those 3 days?
To be honest, I just glanced at it myself. I didn't.
Okay.
Although that didn't stop me from commenting on it. No, I mean, a lot of it is framed by this question about what is theft, right? Is infringement theft? I don't care, frankly. I think there's no productive way through these questions by insisting on the equivalence between the theft of material property and the theft and the infringement of intellectual property. That's just, I tired of that debate some time ago. I just don't think it's a productive way to frame it, even to move forward. So Harold was trying to tease out a more kind of accommodating position on it. I think in some sectors of the business, this is not even an issue anymore. There are a lot of record companies and bands that are just, whatever, they're just past it. It's what people are doing. And historically, the law adjusts to legalize what it is people are doing over time because the costs of not doing so are high. So, I'm sympathetic to the idea that you have to enforce against, well, the version of the legal market that emerges from this is much lower priced, and its pricing is set in relation to the pirate market, and you see that you see that already in some of the low cost distribution models that are already in business, already becoming the incumbents, the Netflix, the Hulus, and that at that point there's a role for enforcement to go after anybody who's trying to disrupt the legal market to make a buck. Right? So that's the traditional standard for enforcement, criminal enforcement, commercial activity. There's a fine line there when because it's not clear what commercial activity is in these contexts. Is it selling advertisements on the Pirate Bay? But that's where you have to start drawing your distinctions. The rest of the stuff, the consumer activity, all the things that are on a clear continuum with the basic functions of the internet, linking, sharing, copying a file, sending a file. That stuff has to be legalized at some point. It's just not. There's nothing to be gained by subjecting that to the kind of crazy net act penalties that are currently on the books.
So because the box office is often a loss leader for DVD sales, do you think it's possible that one of the reasons that the U.S. doesn't care about the emerging market is because of cultural quotas on the box office? In some places, they can only get a couple films in a year. China has very strict quotas. Could that be one of the reasons why they don't really care about those markets as much, changing prices?
China's the only really rigorous example of that I'm aware of.
There are a couple other cases, often in smaller European countries.
Well, the European cultural policies, yeah. I mean, so France, Canada, and those have been the two cultural exception countries traditionally. Most of the places we've looked at, though, I mean, it's really the difference between almost total Hollywood control of the markets, 80% or more, and then there's India, which is the reverse. China's an interesting case that we touched on but don't really get into. China limited. I think the limit is currently set at 20 movies, but until recently it was 10. I think that only 20 non-Chinese films are permitted to be exhibited in a given year. So, there are a whole set of exceptions around how companies deal with China, and I think there is again, we just scratched the surface of it, but there's a real exceptionalism there that basically means that countries will do anything to stay in the Chinese market. So the Chinese state-run distributors cut prices in 05, 06 on DVDs because there was this enormous gap between the legal price and the pirate price, and Paramount and Warner had to follow. So there was this experiment in China with reduced DVD pricing that, overshot and then adjusted, and now prices are quite a bit lower. They're certainly a lot lower than they are in South Africa or Brazil. But
Did this affect piracy then?
I'm sorry?
Did they see a measurable effect on piracy after they
No.
lowered the prices?
No, and there's no guarantee that they will. I think this is another version of the story that circulates. Piracy will kill, or lower prices will kill piracy. That's one version of the story of how this report gets picked up in the press, and we don't argue that. I think lower prices lower prices will be an outcome of more competitive markets, and that therefore they're a good independent of the effects on piracy. Now, what will happen is that companies will set their prices in order to try and cannibalize the pirate market and remain viable as commercial enterprises. But it'll always be in relation to a certain amount of piracy. That's not really eradicable from our perspective. Nor should it be, for that matter, because absent that pressure, none of these companies would have innovated to provide lower cost access. François?
In countries that have a significant domestic production, do you notice a difference in the piracy of foreign movies or foreign content versus domestic content? So India, Nigeria.
Well, with respect to the movies, I'm not sure I have an answer to that one. There's a lot more local repertoire as soon as you look in music, in the music area, and there it's pretty clear that once you get below the threshold of international pop hits, most of the piracy is local repertoire. It's also true that on the enforcement side, there's again, we have a number of really interesting data points on this, but not enough to really constitute an argument. But there's a lot of preferential treatment for local content in enforcement, and a kind of nationalistic discourse that circulates both among the enforcement people and among, in the education campaigns and ultimately among the retailers about what kinds of goods they're allowed to pirate. So, we documented this in India and Bolivia and Mexico, and it's really quite funny in the level because there's a moralistic and nationalistic discourse around the piracy of local goods that makes that less acceptable, and then meanwhile the Dark Knight and all the Hollywood stuff is readily available.
Yeah, I'm really struck by this. Just reminded me of my freshman economics course and the behavior of the monopolists. I mean, it's like exactly price discrimination. Okay, when there's competition, price fall, but when there's not, we're concerned that degradation of our price level will force us to lose our capture of our main market. And the key thing I think maybe that was too long ago, and they don't talk about this in economics anymore, but what we were taught at that time was that this was bad. That whenever the monopolist was doing this, this was bad from a sort of societal utility point of view. So I don't know if that's acknowledged or, Valente, basically like they're saying, the government's supposed to be enforcing our monopoly. Why aren't they doing it? That's what I hear in what you're saying.
Yeah.
Is that acknowledged at all? Does anyone...
Acknowledged on the industry side or in the policy base?
Is anyone, the industry's not going to say that because they're the monopolist, but the idea that they could have the brazenness to say, I'm just surprised by that.
Well, it never gets characterized that way in public among I think that is what's going on. They want, an even strong, the copyright is already a government monopoly on,
right.
On the cultural production with certain limitations, and they want that to extend to much stronger public investment in enforcement. So enforcement was always a private function, with certain, certain exceptions. that's not true anymore, and it's, the whole, I mean, if you look at the bills that have come up over the last few years, and the Pro-IP Act, which gave us an IP czar, who's given us a series of recommendations about strengthening criminal law, ramping up the Department of Justice to enforce, to go after copyright infringement. I mean, there's a real process of capture of public resources by the industry to ensure that enforcement is also a public function. And and that's also part of the monopoly politics of this. Yeah.
Please join me again in thanking Joe.